Hey, welcome back to Cinemania Recapped, and thanks for clicking on this recap. In the beginning of the movie, we see a phone ringing, which is picked up by Cassie. It's an unknown call, so Cassie hangs up. The phone rings again, and Cassie picks it up once more. It's the same unknown caller. The caller apologizes for calling her by mistake, so Cassie forgives him and hangs up again. As Cassie is home alone, she prepares something to eat. Then her phone rings again, and this time it's also the same unknown caller. Cassie asks him his name, to which he replies that she should tell him her name first, and then he will tell her his. The unknown caller asks Cassie what kind of movies she likes, and she replies that she likes scary movies. The unknown caller then asks her which is her favorite horror movie. On this, she tells him her favorite movie is Halloween. The unknown caller then asks Cassie if she has a boyfriend, to which Cassie responds, no. The unknown caller starts talking about some creepy stuff, causing Cassie to run towards the door in fear. Cassie feels that the unknown caller is nearby her house, so she starts looking around and then hangs up. The caller phones again and threatens Cassie not to hang up again, or he will chop her into bits. Cassie is horrified, therefore runs outside her house, and just then the doorbell rings, which makes her cry out of fear even more. She tells the unknown caller to leave her alone because whoever he is, her boyfriend will kill him for sure. The caller reveals before she can finish that her boyfriend's name is Steve. Hearing her boyfriend's name from the caller terrifies Cassie. The caller tells Cassie to turn on her garden light, so she turns on the outside light. Now she finds her boyfriend Steve tied up on a chair with his mouth taped shut. The unknown caller asks Cassie to play a game, saying he will ask her some simple questions. If she answers correctly, then Steve will remain alive. He first asks what the killer's name was in the Halloween movie, to which Cassie replies, Michael Myers. After that, the unknown caller asks the next question, which is what the killer's name was in Friday the 13th. But this time, Cassie answers incorrectly, and as a result, the unknown caller, who sounds to be a psychopath by his way of talking, brutally butches Steve. Cassie gets extremely scared. The unknown caller says the game isn't over yet, so she should get ready for the last question. He then asks Cassie the scariest question yet. He asks Cassie, tell me which door of your house I'm at. Cassie understands that her death is near when suddenly someone breaks down the front door, causing her to fearfully run to the kitchen and grabs a knife to protect herself. She manages to escape through the back door of the house, where she sees the serial killer inside her home. Cassie's parents are also on their way home, which gives her some comfort, but the killer, who is in a ghost face costume, grabs Cassie. She tries to escape with her life, but the serial killer catches Cassie and brutally stabs her and makes her seriously stricken. Cassie struggles to get up and tries to attract her parents' attention, but they cannot hear her voice and go inside the house. Outside, the killer horrifically attacks Cassie's body. Meanwhile, her parents return home to find the house in terrible condition, realizing that something bad has happened. When Cassie's parents come outside, they discover their daughter hanging from a tree. Now we see the protagonist of the movie, Sydney Prescott, who is currently working on the computer. She goes to look out the window. Out of nowhere, her boyfriend Billy shows up. Sydney's father hears the noise in her room and comes there. He notifies Sydney that he will be out for the weekend for an important exhibition, so she needs to take care of herself, then he leaves. Billy tries to seduce Sydney by romancing her, but she is not ready for such things after her mother's death. When Billy realizes he is not getting what he came for, he also leaves. The scene now cuts to a small town in California named Woodsboro, where we see a police team. This is the same area where the serial killer had slaughtered Cassie and her boyfriend Steve the previous night. Sydney arrives there and becomes a bit unsettled seeing the scene. Here, her best friend Tatum shows up. Tatum reveals to her that the last night, Cassie and her boyfriend Steve were killed horribly, and it was even in a horror movie style. The killer ripped them apart from top to bottom. The killer has not been caught yet, meaning he is on the loose. Now the police are interrogating everyone in college. Now it's Sydney's turn, and Sheriff Burke and Deputy Dewey ask her some intense questions related to Cassie's murder. We now see Sydney with her friends, each presenting their own theories about Cassie's death. Stuart, who is Tatum's boyfriend, says that the murder must have been committed by a man. Randy tells Stuart that you also liked Cassie, so you could also be her murderer because she chose Steve over you, and perhaps you killed her to take revenge for this. After this, Sydney comes straight home from her college and locks the door securely from inside. She turns on the TV to relieve her fatigue, where she hears news about Cassie's murder on every channel. While switching the channels, she comes across a murder mystery about her mother, Lauren Prescott, who was raped and killed by Cotton Weary. So she turns off the TV and starts looking at her mother's photo, after which she falls asleep. Around 7:30 p.m., a phone call comes in. The caller already knows Sydney's name, and when Sydney asks for the caller's name, he tells her to guess who he might be. The serial killer asks Sydney the same question he had asked Cassie the previous night before butchering her. He asks Sydney for the name of her favorite horror movie, on which she replies that she doesn't watch horror movies because it's all nonsense. The serial killer tells Sydney that he knows she is alone at home and asks her to guess where he is. Sydney says she doesn't know, and he then tells her that he is on her porch. Sydney goes to look outside, but she sees no one over there. Now she starts searching for the psychopath around her, but doesn't find anyone nearby. Sydney thinks that maybe one of her friends is playing a prank on her, so she is about to hang up. The killer tells her that if she hangs up, he will send her to hell to be with her mother. "Do you want to die, Sydney?" Hearing this, the ground slips from under Sydney's feet. After this, the same serial killer enters Sydney's house and starts attacking her like a madman. Just as the serial killer is about to stab Sydney with his knife, she kicks him and knocks him down. Sydney now runs upstairs to save her life and locks herself in a room. The killer tries to break down the door, but before he can, Sydney sends an emergency message to the police. Just then, Billy shows up there through the window. He tries to calm Sydney, but during this, his cell phone falls out of his pocket, which Sydney sees. Sydney becomes suspicious of Billy and thinks that he was the one harassing her on the phone and had tried to kill her. Scared of Billy, Sydney starts running towards the main door. Just then, Deputy Dewey arrives there because Sydney had already sent an emergency message to the police. The police take Billy into custody based on suspicion. Sheriff Burke also arrives and asks Sydney to come to the police station to file her statement so that she remains safe in the future. Tatum also comes there to help Sydney. Here, Tatum and Deputy are siblings. News reporter Gail Weathers also arrives to cover the story. Now the scene shifts, and we see Sydney filing a missing report for her father at the police station. Her father, Neil Prescott, has not returned since he went to his exhibition. Now the sheriff is interrogating Billy and asks him how he got the cell phone and why he went to Sydney's house at such a late hour. Billy is unable to provide satisfactory answers to these questions. So the sheriff orders him to remain in police custody until Billy's call details are investigated. Here, Billy's father is also present to defend him. To avoid the media, Deputy Dewey sneaks Sydney and Tatum out of the police station through the back door, but Gail arrives there. Sydney punches Gail hard in the face because she spread false news about her mother. Now Sydney is at Tatum's house, where she tells her that when the killer came to kill her, Billy was present. Just then, Tatum's mother gets in and informs Sydney that there is a phone call for her. When Sydney goes to answer the phone, the killer is on the other end. He tells Sydney that she has unjustly implicated Billy, and then the serial killer hangs up. After this, Sydney is watching news where the news reports that Sydney's mother, Lauren Prescott, was murdered by Cotton Weary and that he will receive a capital punishment. Deputy tells Sydney that Billy is innocent because his call details have been checked, revealing that the calls were not made from his phone, which means the killer is someone else. As Sydney is going to college, she bumps into Gail, who tells her that she thinks Cotton Weary killed her mother, while the truth is that he is innocent. The real killer is still free and killing people every other day. Cotton Weary did not kill your mother, but is being framed. Sydney is now at college and talking to Tatum and Stewart when a boy dressed in a ghost-faced costume runs past, which scares Sydney. She starts running and bumps into Billy. Here, Sydney apologizes to Billy for the accusations she made against him. We then see Principal Himbry scolding the boys who were scaring others while wearing the ghost-faced costume. The scene shifts to Sydney in the women's restroom at school. In the restroom, she hears someone calling her under his breath. When she checks carefully, she finds no one, but soon she hears the voice again, which forces her to get scared and check the restroom again. Now the serial killer emerges from the restroom and attacks her. However, Sydney manages to escape. Following this, it is announced by the Woodsboro police station that a complete curfew will be imposed throughout the town after 9 p.m. Sydney tells Tatum that the killer once again tried to kill her in the restroom. Here, Stuart arrives and lifts Tatum onto his shoulder and invites everyone to his farmhouse for a party that night. Sydney reluctantly gets ready for the party. We then see Mr. Himbry, who is attacked by the same serial killer who stabs him in the stomach and kills him. After this, we see Sydney and Tatum. Tatum tells Sydney that her mother had relationships with countless men and perhaps one of them killed her mother. After this, Sydney leaves with Tatum for the party, but we see the same killer stalking Sydney and Tatum in the background. Now the scene shifts to Randy, who believes that Billy is responsible for all the murders occurring in the city. According to him, Billy is the serial killer. Whether Randy is right or not will be revealed later. Deputy has brought Sydney and Tatum to Stuart's farmhouse for the night party. We see that everyone is partying in the secluded house. News reporter Gail also arrives with her assistant Kenny because she believes that something will definitely go wrong tonight. Just then, the deputy bumps into her and asks her why she is there, to which Gail deflects the question and requests to go inside with the deputy. Gail and the deputy enter and inspect the situation in the house. When Gail seizes the right opportunity, she quietly hides a camera there. Now the scene shifts to Tatum, who is heading off towards the garage to get bottles of beer. She was coming back with the beer bottles when the killer shows up there. Tatum thinks it's one of her friends playing a prank on her, and so she also starts having fun with the serial killer. The killer soon shows his true colors after a very short while and attacks Tatum with a knife. Tatum starts throwing broken beer bottles at him and then tries to escape through a small entrance in the garage shutter, but her half body gets stuck in the shutter. Meanwhile, the serial killer activates the garage shutter, causing it to lift up, due to which Tatum's neck breaks apart and results in her death. Now the killer sets off for his next victim. Sydney is looking for Tatum when Billy gets back again. He wants to reconcile with Sydney. Billy tells Sydney that he needs to talk to her, to which Sydney replies that she also has something personal to discuss. So they both go upstairs to talk. News reporter Gail is also watching everything from the hidden camera she placed in the room, as she suspects that the killer will definitely show up tonight. The scene cuts back to Sydney and Billy, who are clearing up misunderstandings between them. In the midst of their conversation, Sydney tells Billy that she wants to move on in life, and she has now learned that her mother was a slut and had illicit relationships with many men. She didn't want to end up like them. After this, Sydney herself offers to become intimate with Billy, to which he gladly agrees. After all, that's what Billy wanted. Why? We will find out soon. Then they both start getting intimate. Outside, everyone is watching a horror movie in which Randy predicts what will happen next. Randy begins to explain the rules of horror movies to everyone. Randy says that the first rule of horror movies is to never have sex. The second rule is to never drink alcohol or take drugs, which everyone is doing. Then he explains the last rule, saying that under no circumstances should anyone say, "I'll be right back," because in reality, once you leave, you never return. Randy says that whoever breaks these three rules has to die in horror movies. It's important to note that Sydney has also broken the first rule, meaning she has had sex with Billy, and all her friends have been drinking heavily, which means no one is safe. Now Randy receives a phone call where he learns that the killer has also murdered Principal Himbry. He was gutted and hanged from the goalpost. Therefore, everyone immediately heads out to see their dead bodies. On the way, Deputy and Gail are going together. Suddenly, Randy's friends in their cars try to run over them, but by God's grace, they narrowly escape. The deputy finds Sydney's father's car there, which makes him suspicious that the serial killer is nearby. After being intimate with Billy, Sydney asks him whom he called when he was in the police station. Billy gives a doubtful answer. Billy asks Sydney if she still thinks it was him. Billy starts rambling again when suddenly the same serial killer enters their room and violently attacks Billy. He stabs Billy in the chest 8 to 10 times, causing Billy to collapse badly. Now the killer turns his attention to Sydney and tries to make her his next prey. Sydney runs and locks herself in a room, calling for help from the window. Soon the killer breaks in and catches her by the window. The serial killer pushes Sydney down. She falls onto a car below. Sydney manages to get hold of herself and looks up to see her best friend, Tatum's dead body, hanging from the garage shutter, frightening her a lot. She rushes directly to Gail's assistant Kenny for help. Kenny gets her into his car, but the killer arrives there and slits Kenny's throat, sending him to his grave. Sydney escapes from there, and the deputy rushes into Stuart's house to catch the killer, but finds no one there, as the killer is actually after Sydney. As Miss Gale starts her car to get away safely, she notices that windshield is completely smeared with blood. Nonetheless, she attempts to drive away immediately. Meanwhile, Sydney arrives, and in the attempt to save her, Gale's car swerves and crashes into a tree below. Sydney calls out to the deputy for help, and just then the deputy comes out of Stuart's house, but he has a knife stuck in his back and falls to the floor. The serial killer shows up and starts chasing Sydney. Sydney jumps into a car and tries to start it, but the car keys are outside in the hands of the psychopath killer. The killer opens the trunk and gets in, but Sydney quickly jumps out of the car and runs outside. Just as Randy and Stuart arrive and start accusing each other of being the killer, Sydney pushes both of them outside and locks the door from inside. Now Billy rolls down the stairs and manages to recover, raising suspicions. Billy gets Randy inside first. Now the biggest twist in the story confronts Sydney. Billy shoots Randy in the shoulder, revealing that Billy is the actual serial killer, having become a psychopath and mentally unstable due to watching horror movies too often. Then Stuart arrives, who has been assisting Billy in all this. Billy shows Sydney a phone call, indicating that both Billy and Stuart are the masterminds behind the murders. Sydney now finds herself cornered by both demented psychopaths. Here, Billy reveals that he killed Sydney's mother, Lauren Prescott, because of her illicit relationship with his father, which led to his real mother leaving him. Now Stuart brings Sydney's father before her, who is completely tied up. The two psychos begin playing a game of stabbing each other, making it clear that they are both mentally unstable. After that, Billy asks Stuart to fetch a gun. Stuart goes looking for the gun, but finds nothing because Gale has already taken it. Gale points the gun at Billy and Stuart. She pulls the trigger, but forgets to disengage the safety lock, allowing Billy to overpower her. Sydney takes this opportunity to escape. Now both start searching for Sydney. Just then, a phone call comes in, and Sydney tells Billy that she wants to play a death game with both of them. Billy hands the phone to Stuart and goes off to find her. While Billy is searching for her, Sydney stabs him in the chest with the sharp end of an umbrella, knocking him unconscious. Stuart also arrives to help Billy, but Sydney drops a TV on his head, putting him to eternal rest. Now, thinking Billy is dead, Sydney approaches him, but he gets back up and starts throttling her. Just as he's about to kill Sydney, Gale arrives and shoots Billy. A little while later, Billy comes back to life, but this time Sydney shoots him in the head, ensuring he is quiet forever. In the final scene of the movie, we see the police arriving at the crime scene and beginning to take all the survivors away. Meanwhile, Gale Weathers has already started her reporting, and this scene marks the end of the movie.